Good morning. Flower power robotics.
The two machines can plant about 23,000 bulbs an hour. We're doing now the same operation that we would have been doing last year with 14 people, with 3 or 4 people.
Warnings about the impact of climate change.
There are things we can do to help to protect the UK farming sector and food prices from those risks, but we need action now from government.
But there's welcome news on a new trade deal.
High-end products, big demand in the Middle East, an enormous opportunity for the UK to expand all of that with a lot less tariffs. This is really good.
We'll have more on that later. Let's start with a big bouquet of flowers. All week we've been celebrating British blooms. The cut flower market in the UK is worth around £2.2 billion, but most of the stems sold in supermarkets and florists don't come from British farms. But there is a growing network of producers trying to change that. Kate Fox is one of them. She set up the South Yorkshire Flower Hub, bringing local growers and florists together to create an online wholesale market of seasonal British-grown flowers. Mary Ward-Lowry has been to Gringley on the Hill in Nottinghamshire to find out more.
Got a bit of all sorts, got some larkspur coming, some sweet peas, some butterfly ranunculus. So I've been flower farming for about 5 years. I thought, how can you make it easier for smaller growers to get involved? So I thought, why don't we all load up our flowers into one central website, and then the florist can shop from that as though it was a wholesale website.
And these are all local flowers, these are all British grown flowers?
Yeah, every one of the growers that are on our South Yorkshire Flower Hub are grown without pesticides, without herbicides.
The growers bring the flowers they've sold on Kate's app to a central location where the florists then pick them up.
It's been going really well. It was really satisfying to get a really big order from a florist that had never done a British wedding before, and we managed to service it and we delivered. So 4 growers contributed to that one wedding.
And how many flowers was that?
It was an absolute van full, but I would say in excess of 700 stems.
Since March, Kate signed up 37 florists and 22 growers. It also makes British flowers more accessible to local florists who might never have worked with them before. So it's about sustainability too.
I think we'll start to increasingly question the legitimacy of importing flowers from the other side of the world. And I know there's the argument that in Africa or Colombia or these kind of places that flowers are a profitable crop and you're contributing to that economy. There's a lot of damage from water usage, probably not the same standards and specifications around pesticide usage that we would have in this country. How do I make this better? Just choose local flowers, choose seasonal flowers, low carbon, no pesticides, low impact, and that's just got to be better, hasn't it?
Kate Fox there from Fox Farm Flowers. Well, there are big flower producers too. In Norfolk, Collinson Cut Flowers near King's Lynn grows 35 million tulips every year, supplying most of the UK's leading supermarkets. With fierce competition, particularly from Holland, it's invested £5 million in new technology to stay in the game. Bob Hockenhull visited one of its glasshouses with director Ian Collinson.
This is what we call our tulip forcing house. So we're trying to recreate the perfect spring day. So we're heating the glass house to 16.5 degrees. In here we've invested heavily in automation. The tulips are all grown hydroponically in plastic trays. So all the operations that we were doing by hand is now all being done by machinery, by automation and robotics.
And why did you decide to do that?
Cost of labour is increasing relentlessly in the UK. Our competition on tulips really comes from Holland, where they also have a relatively high wage structure, but they're very highly automated. So if we weren't, we would be uncompetitive.
We've got some robots here handling the bulbs.
The bulbs are singulated onto the conveyor belt in the middle of the machine. We then take 6 images of every bulb. We can then put that through a piece of AI software. If the bulb is diseased, the robots won't pick it up. If it's not diseased, then the robots will pick it up, place it into the tray with the roots facing down towards the water and the sprout facing up towards the sky. The 2 machines can plant about 23,000 bulbs an hour. We're doing now the same operation that we would have been doing last year with 14 people, with 3 or 4 people.
Total workforce was 100 before automation, now it's down to 70. Krazy Chavdarov worked here before the technology was installed. and now works alongside it.
Now everything is getting easier for us to do it and faster. Also with the technologies, we are improving the quality of the bunches.
Are you worried that even more technology might come and that there'll be less need for human beings?
In some point, yes, that will happen, definitely. Not in next 5 years, but in maybe 50 years' time that will happen. But we can't change nothing.
Collinson Cut Flowers is celebrating its 60th anniversary this year and has had to change with the times. Ian Collinson again.
Certain parts of the business are definitely recognisable as to how Mum and Dad would have been doing things back then, planting, the scented stocks that we plant in the soil, whereas something like tulips at that time would have been completely unrecognisable. Hydroponic tulips weren't around then, so tulips would have been produced maybe in crates, but they would have then been planted in soil with, sand on top. A lot of very, very heavy manual labour, lots of disease risk, a very, very long growing period, and that's completely changed around now. We're in a very efficient, very clean, fast hydroponic system, which has completely revolutionised tulip production around the world.
Ian Collinson ending that report from Bob Hockenhull. And this week's Rare Earth takes a deeper dive into all things floral, exploring how flowers have evolved to attract pollinators and how they can help restore lost landscapes. You can hear more from botanists and pollen experts by searching for Rare Earth on BBC Sounds. Well, like the generational change at Collinson's, the Duchy of Cornwall is also facing some fundamental rethinking. A fifth of the Duchy's property, owned by the Prince of Wales, could be sold in the next 10 years to help invest £500 million into tackling housing and nature crises. The Duchy has a large number of tenant farmers and is introducing a new tenancy agreement which concentrates on regenerative farming. The first one's a 25-year tenancy on a 900-acre farm in Herefordshire. Kaz Graham spoke to Matthew Morris, Executive Director for Rural at the Duchy of Cornwall.
So we want to create a framework that allows our tenants to go on the regenerative journey, but in a way that's supported. So they're going to have technical guidance, support from our team, but most of all, they've got that long-term security to make the transition.
How does the Duchy define regenerative?
So we follow the principles of regenerative agriculture, so maintaining soil health, maintaining cover in the winter. Across the Duchy, we've got farms in the lowlands, we've got farms up on Dartmoor and, of course, out on the Isles of Scilly as well. So each of those farms will have a slightly different way of approaching regenerative. There's no right or wrong answer.
It's not an easy time to be starting out with something like that. Politically, farmers have no certainty about where they're going to be in the future. In terms of funding, everything is up in the air at the moment. What kind of support are you going to give? Are you going to give financial support to those tenants?
Well, first and foremost, the biggest support we can give is a long-term lease, which enables them to plan ahead and to go through the transition to regen. So in that journey, we're going to be working with funders, verification standards. But most of all, with our farming and nature team, we are going to be there alongside them for the journey. So much more collaborative. We've got a number of focus farms as well. So we've got farms across the Duchy that we're working super closely with. They're able to sort of show their fellow farmers what they've been doing, and they can talk to the successes and also the failures. And I think that's really important.
You have many farms across the Duchy, and this is just part of a kind of transformation of what you're doing within the Duchy estate, which has included some pretty tough decisions, actually, hasn't it? I mean, for example, recently you've decided to sell off farms and property in the village of Bradninch in Devon, which has faced really severe local criticism. Why did you do that specifically?
Yeah, so the Duchy's always been on a journey of buying and selling farms. We have a large portfolio, and that's something that the Duchy's always done. What we want to do is just make sure that we are equipped for the future, and we want to make sure that we're able to deliver brilliantly for our communities and for nature. So the portfolio is undergoing a bit of a rebalancing exercise. But our regen journey really on our retained estate is something that we're really diving into. We think that's going to take some time. We're not doing every tenant at once, but we're looking forward to supporting all of our farmers on that journey.
When you say we're not doing every farm at once, does that imply that all Duchy farms will be farming regeneratively in the future?
Ultimately, that is our ambition. So as we have tenancy renewals, as we have new lettings, we'll be using our new RFBT as a template to help that journey.
What if one of your existing farmers does not want to make that change?
Well, ultimately, tenants have freedom of choice. I mean, that's a central part of any landlord and tenant relationship. What I hope, though, is that they see the change. They see their fellow farmers and what they're doing. And in these dry summers we've had recently, looking over the fence and seeing a lush green field when yours is burnt off, it's those sorts of things that are going to drive change.
Matthew Morris from the Duchy of Cornwall. Well, the Duchy's focus on regenerative farming comes just as the Climate Change Committee this week published some dire warnings about the possible consequences of a 2% rise in global temperatures and what the UK needs to do about it. The report by the CCC, which advises UK governments on adapting to climate change, highlights risks from extreme heat, drought and flooding, and says that by 2050, 92% of homes are likely to overheat and water supply shortfalls could exceed 5 billion litres a day. Responding to the report, the government said it had already invested a record £2.65 billion in flood defences and had deployed the largest nature-friendly farming budget in history to support sustainable food production. Emma Pinchbeck is CEO of the Climate Change Committee.
As always, when you're thinking about climate change, farmers are the providers of solutions, thinking about approaches to the landscape that help reduce the risks of flooding and investing in nature restoration, but also thinking about what we need to do to keep farming viable in itself. So how can we change how we think about, for example, water storage on farms to help a community response to a drought or multiple farms responding to a drought rather than an individual farm, changing the sorts of crops that we grow to build a more resilient natural landscape, but also to keep food production at today's levels.
DEFRA might say that many of the things you've mentioned are already included in its environmental schemes. Are you saying that the government needs to give farmers more help to do this?
We are absolutely saying that farmers need more help from the government, and that's in a number of ways. If you look at things like subsidies or support for farmers, we don't think that those are properly targeted at the world as it is and will be. They should support nature resilience, but also there's regulation and planning that actively harm farmers being able to have an adaptive response. Farmers, for example, cannot currently share water storage between farms. We are definitely saying that DEFRA needs to do more for the farming community to keep farming viable.
What about food security? What risks do we face around that?
In most cases, there are actions that farmers can take to help reduce their exposure to those risks. And that includes things like planting different kinds of crop, more mixed farming, being able to store water, thinking about shading alongside having livestock so that there is less exposure to heat for livestock and therefore a reduction in yield on things like milk. So there are really practical things that farmers will be able to do. Beyond that, there are also risks from things like extreme heat abroad affecting commodities, and we've seen prices for things like olive oil already going up in response to wildfires in Europe, and other imported risks to farming like increased diseases or different kinds of diseases. Again, there are things we can do to help to protect the UK farming sector and food prices from those risks, but we need action now from government and from major food retailers and businesses that look after those international food supply chains.
Emma Pinchbeck, CEO of the Climate Change Committee. Well, it seems pressure on farming is coming from many angles at the moment, as the cost of growing our food is still higher than before the conflict in the Middle East. To counteract some of that, earlier this week the government laid out a Great British Savings Bonanza aimed at making life a little less expensive for everyone. And as part of that, there'll be cuts to tariffs on more than 100 food imports sold in supermarkets to help reduce pressure on food prices. We don't know which products yet. The government's also going to reduce fuel duty on red diesel used by farmers by a third. We'll get the NFU's thoughts on that shortly, but our reporter Theo White has been to a fruit farm in Kent to find out how they're faring with rising costs. Hugh Low Farms grows strawberries, blackberries and raspberries. Marion Reagan, the managing director, met Theo in a polytunnel full of strawberry plants.
What you can see here are that we've got a
huge gales just blowing.
I know.
Lucky we're undercover here.
That's why you can see we're in a tunnel. So what you can see is a plant with a number of open flowers, some ripening fruit, and some red fruit further up the row.
So picking started elsewhere, I understand, but not here yet.
We start under glass, and then we quite quickly move into these unheated polytunnels.
So speaking of glass houses, they're obviously quite an expensive thing to heat at the best of times. Is this somewhere you've seen the energy costs affect your profit margins?
We're quite fortunate in that we had sort of hedged our energy costs in our glass, and we don't try and go particularly early, so we're not putting a lot of heat into glass. With the rising cost of energy, I think it has challenged some glasshouse growers quite severely. Now it's the effect of energy costs on other inputs. So the big costs that we are looking at, it's the growing costs, the fertiliser, and of the people who we value who harvest the crop.
So once you've grown it, you've got to get it to your customers.
Yes.
You've got big customers all over the country. Obviously, logistics become a big thing here. So talk to me about fuel price, and is that something you've been feeling?
Well, yes, fuel price affecting haulage costs and also fuel price affecting packaging. There are things that one can do to make sure that orders are smoothly fulfilled, that you're going to the closest depot. You know, there's lots of work in that logistic piece which can take cost out of the chain. British growers are amongst the most innovative, most efficient in the world.
To be honest, you don't sound too pessimistic, so I'll be interested to know your answer to this. But how do you think things are going to go this summer for British berry growers? Are you worried?
I think it's a storm that can be weathered, and I also am eternally optimistic because I am a British berry grower and it's May. And actually I think the crop looks really good and everything we picked so far has been delicious.
I'm interested to know whether or not you think the government should be stepping in times like these where energy costs have unexpectedly risen for British farmers.
I think that the specialist glasshouse growers have a good case to make when other sectors have made that case successfully to government. Taken in the round, I think British fruit growing, like British farming, needs the support of the government in terms of a good environment for doing business, for being able to have the confidence to invest in these crops because it's a substantial capital investment. And I think that between growers, government, but also customers, we can create a resilient and healthy sector of soft fruit.
Marion Reagan there. A DEFRA spokesperson told us fruit and vegetable growers are central to our growth mission and horticulture will be a priority sector under the new Farming and Food Partnership Board. They said the government had given a record £11.8 billion in funding over this Parliament and extended the seasonal worker visa scheme while slashing costs and red tape for producers to export to the EU. Well, exports further afield than the EU were in the spotlight as a new trade deal was announced with a group of 6 states in the Gulf, including Saudi Arabia and Bahrain. It'll remove export tariffs and open the door to market expansion, although concerns have been raised about the human rights records of some of those Gulf states. Chris Southworth is Secretary-General of the International Chamber of Commerce, UK. He spoke to Kaz Graham.
You know, we're talking about very practical things. This is good for the regions, good for the north, particularly Scotland. Think salmon, think whiskey. The rest of the UK, think chocolate, cheese, biscuits, tea, halal beef, all of which are high-end products, big demand in the Middle East, an enormous opportunity for the UK to expand all of that with a lot less tariffs. This is a 93% reduction in tariffs. This is really good for trade liberalisation.
And how significant is this deal compared to, say, some of the other deals that we've already seen, things like the trade agreements with South Korea and India?
I think it's really important in the context of a major emerging region, more or less on par with the likes of South Korea, above what we were negotiating with the likes of Australia and New Zealand a few years ago. Should be good news for the farming sector and production sector in the UK. And it's coming at a really good time where things are very challenging. As we all know, we can see the news. This is exactly the kind of direction that we need to see the UK going in.
Where does it sit alongside the Chancellor's announcement yesterday that she's cutting import tariffs on some foodstuffs? I mean, we don't know what the full list of products is yet, but if some imports are going to be cheaper in the shops here, what effect will that have on UK farmers?
There has to be a fine balance struck here, but this is also about reducing the cost of living. So the Chancellor's in a difficult place where she has to balance what comes in, what goes out. But actually, we're, I think, 40% food reliant on other countries. So we don't produce enough food for our own population. We rely on imports. That's a really important part of our food security. We rely on other countries supporting exports in terms of generating growth, but also allowing more imports coming in with fewer duties that allow us or our producers, manufacturers, to have less input costs in order to get those costs on the shelves reduced for the consumer. It's really important.
Chris Southworth from the ICC, and as he was saying, that trade deal with those Gulf states should offer new opportunities for British food and farming. So alongside the cut in fuel duty on red diesel, it looks as though farmers might just be happy with the government for once. Kaz spoke to NFU President Tom Bradshaw from the Devon County Show.
First of all, the trade deal with the Gulf states is one where there's great opportunity for our British food that has such a high reputation, and for them to safeguard our sensitive sectors within that trade deal while opening up access to the Gulf states is something that we really welcome, and we respect the way they've negotiated that trade deal. And then on the red diesel duty, look, we know how much we've seen red diesel prices rise since the start of this conflict. Our members are highly exposed to this, so the recognition from government of how severe it is, and also the action in reducing that fuel duty, is something that's very welcome across the farming industry.
What do you make of these reduced tariffs on some food imports announced by the Chancellor?
Well, look, clearly, if those tariff reductions are on food that we produce here, then that's something that's going to be incredibly concerning for those members that are producing those goods. So we await the detailed list with real interest.
I mean, the government says that the list of products that are involved will be announced next week, and that it does take account of domestic production and food security, and says it doesn't include any significant UK primary agricultural production. Are you confident that that'll be okay? Are you happy with that statement?
That we've been working very hard with the government to try and make sure they understand exactly what we do produce and where we would be most worried about those tariff reductions. But more long term, every time we have a global shock, we can't have a knee-jerk reaction that says, how can we make it cheaper from somewhere else? We should be asking the question, how do we create the investment in UK food production that builds the resilience? We've got that production here and we're less impacted.
You're at the Devon County Show. Do you think people are feeling a little more positive?
There's a real nervousness in the farming industry. They can see all of the challenges with fertiliser prices, energy costs, milk prices collapsing. But I think what these signals start to show is a government which, particularly with the red diesel, is in tune with the challenge. But we will be watching very, very closely about those the reduction in tariffs, because we understand the cost of living crisis, but there's a cost of farming crisis as well. And everybody in this country needs a resilient food system, and profitable, thriving farming businesses is the only way we can deliver the resilience in that food system for the long term.
President of the NFU, Tom Bradshaw. We are trying to stay positive on this programme this bank holiday weekend. Now, you may remember a few months ago we featured this. A choir of farmers who reached the semi-finals of ITV's Britain's Got Talent. Arable farmer Ben Brooke described the moment they got the golden buzzer from judge Amanda Holden.
And obviously she pressed the golden buzzer, and I looked round and all the choir were just like jumping around, and I was just like, we don't even know we've got through yet. And then looked down and it was all gold, and I was just like, woo! Amazing. It's like being in like a family you didn't know you had. It's like, yeah, it's just amazing. Like farming can be like super isolating, and you're in your own thoughts a lot. So if we can raise awareness for mental health within agriculture, that's something that we really want to push.
Ben Brooke from Cambridgeshire, a member of the Hawkstone Choir, who are singing again in Britain's Got Talent tonight. So all the best to them. That's all from us today. I'm Anna Hill. The producer is Rebecca Rooney. Farming Today this week is a BBC Audio Bristol production.